Hello, and welcome back to Arvos With Harvo. It is May now, and time has passed, and it is the end of May. And while the year is going by really quickly, I have now gotten glasses because I'm getting old and my eyesight is deteriorating, and I'm sure all these books probably aren't helping very much, so let's get right into it. Okay, so that's this 7 for this month. Again, I got one of every category, which is very cool, and for some reason, all of the books that I read this month are to some extent crime-themed. I definitely didn't go out of my way to do that, it just is how things turned out to be. So what I figure I'll do is, same as usual, let's go in the order that I read them. Okay, so, wow. The Secret History. This was a thing. It's very funny because this is kind of the book that everyone thinks about when they think about dark academia, you know, that aesthetic of people who work at university and wear tweed jackets and, like, do a lot of drugs and kill a lot of people, like that kind of genre. This is often cited as one of the core texts of that aesthetic. And yet this text seems to really deconstruct that aesthetic. It's trying very hard to illustrate the good and the bad of that kind of insular academic culture. So the story is we follow Richard Papin, who is a bit of a nobody. He comes from a small town in California, and he completed high school, doesn't really know what he wants to do in life, decides to, on a whim, go to a university to study ancient Greek. And he ends up in New England, where the university is studying has a very eccentric ancient Greek program that has 5 students in it and one very charismatic teacher. And so he finds himself really desiring to be within this friendship group, eventually getting in there, trying to pretend that he's quite rich. Everyone else in the friendship group is very, very rich. And then we realize that a bunch of weird stuff goes on. A bunch of really strange stuff goes on. And it's because of these students' position as very privileged and very insular and sheltered, but also very messed up individuals. And so, as I was reading this, I kept thinking, if I was to just describe the plot of this book to somebody else, they would go, what the hell? What the hell? Like, the actual sequence of events of this book is just buck wild, right? Like, the amount of just completely out there stuff that happens everywhere. But for some reason, it really works. I think one of the reasons is because it's big, it's a very chunky novel, and it does take a lot of time establishing very simple things like the environment, the university itself, the friends and what they do on just their day-to-day. We spend a long time before we even really get an inciting incident to the story, and it's all really just focused on Richard Papin starting to learn more about each of these individual strange students, and just having time to hang out with them. And so when things start going really bad, you feel like you've already kind of met these characters and you are quite invested in seeing how they change and grow and bend under pressure. All of that works very well. I had a friend who told me that Donna Tartt's writing style is quite beautiful or aesthetic in that it's worth teaching or studying. I don't think I'd ever teach this because it's just so long, and I don't know if I'd say this has any real literary value. I'm going to be honest. I have seen people analyze this, I've seen people annotate this and highlight things, and I personally don't think it really means anything. I think it's a very cool mystery thriller novel with an interesting setting and interesting characters, but I don't know how much it has to say about anything, really. I just thought it was interesting. I thought it was a very fun read. It's got... What I will say about the writing style is that it's very easy to read, and Donna Tartt is very good at using visual descriptive indicators to push forward the narrative and also give us some information about these characters, right? So we get a lot of really vivid descriptions of the landscape, but all of that is kind of done in service of the plot. And we get these very vivid descriptions of characters and interactions, but all of that helps us better understand these people and what the kind of struggles they go through. So despite being so long, it is also still a very efficient novel. I think it's very worth studying for just how the narrative is conveyed, and on a very technical level, how to string together sentences and paragraphs and chapters in order to keep the reader hooked and keep them immersed with these characters who, despite their very intense flaws, you still want to read more about and you still want to know about them. I do have one really petty criticism of this book, which is that the chapters themselves are way too long. There are chapters in this book that are more than 100 pages, And I feel like that defeats the purpose of a chapter. You know, the chapter is meant to be a division to tell you, here is when you start, here is where you end. And I was just finding myself stopping in the middle of pages, in the middle of here and there, and that kind of impeded my ability to enjoy this book, just because the time investment it expected of me was just so much more than I was ready to give. But I still did finish this very fast. I finished this in, I think, 5 days, because the plot is just laser focused, razor sharp, really, really well structured. I really enjoyed it. And I also think that in the grand scheme of book economics, like market trends and all those things, I don't really want this channel to be about market trends. It's just what I find myself knowing more about. I think that this book in particular began a bit of a trend of publishers taking gambles on early career authors with longer works. So I think the assumption is that if you're starting out as a writer, you probably won't be able to sell a manuscript that's much longer than 100,000 words, because it's a gamble, right? The more words you have in your manuscripts, the more money it's going to cost to publish the book, and the less appealing it might be to someone who's just picking a book off a shelf. Like, you wouldn't pick a book this big unless you had some guarantee that your time investment would be worthwhile, right? And I think The Secret History and a number of books that came after it, the ones that come to my mind immediately are A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara and the other one has immediately escaped me. But the idea that you can get longer works like this, and they do have that kind of lasting impression in our minds and in our culture, I do think it's kind of started by The Secret History, because otherwise, if you're looking for really long works, you're either going back to the 1800s or you are buying works from established authors who have published shorter work before they got the leeway from their publisher to just do whatever they want, right? So that's my thought. That was a big tangent. A 4 out of 5 book. Enjoyable read. I don't think it particularly means anything. Interesting crime-themed, university-themed novel. That's it. Alright, book 2 of this month. I had to read this because I had a student doing this in year 11. This is Twelfth Night, and it's one of Shakespeare's comedies, and it's one of his more festive comedies. The title Twelfth Night refers to I believe the Christmas celebrations. So this play was performed as part of a courtly carnival, and it really shows, right? It doesn't have really any meaningful conflict, I would say. That it's not serious, it's not really meaningful, it's just fun. It's very silly, nonchalant fun. So the premise of this is, after a shipwreck, a young woman named Viola loses her brother Sebastian, and she's shipwrecked on the shores of Illyria, which is this kind of fictionalized Eastern European region, which, because Shakespeare is Shakespeare, is basically just another version of England. And so she decides to disguise herself as a young man, Cesario, so that she can go to the Duke's court and make a living there, right? And so one of the other main characters is Duke Orsino. He is the ruler of this area, and he is lovelorn, very powerful. He starts the play with a monologue talking about how he wants to hear music to pull on his heartstrings and make him feel love more strongly. You get a sense that Duke Orsino's real motivations are to just strengthen his love and to express his love, because that's the extent of value in our society, or his society, was to just love someone and be loved in return, right? And so a bunch of shenanigans ensues. Duke Orsino is in love with a woman named Olivia, and Olivia doesn't seem to like the Duke very much, and in tremendous fashion has decided to put on a mourning costume and say, I am not going to talk to another man for 7 years because my brother has passed away recently. And there is a very thinly veiled hint that she's only doing this because the Duke comes to her every day and goes, Olivia, I love you. And she goes, I'm not going to listen to you, I'm mourning. This big simplification of this play. Anyways, that's about it, right? And then there's characters dressing up as other characters, there's deception, there's confusion, there's a bunch of just random shenanigans, and it's very lighthearted fun. I feel like it would be quite fun to see this on stage, just because it is a real challenge for an actor to dress up as an entire other character and convince the audience that they are pretending to be somebody else while they're pretending to be something else. That's just a Shakespearean trope that he loves to use, and we see that very clearly here. And aside from that, I really don't have anything else to say about this. There are, every now and then there's a joke that lands, every now and then there's a joke that lands uncomfortably because there's a bunch of outdated values there. If you really want to read all of Shakespeare, well, you'll of course read this. If you don't, or if you only want to read the main Shakespearean plays, I don't think Twelfth Night comes up very much as, the top of the top. It is in line with a lot of Shakespeare's other comedies, and after you read 2 or 3 of Shakespeare's comedies, you're like, this is just the same thing over and over again, This isn't that much more meaningfully different from As You Like It, or Midsummer's Night Dream, or lots of other plays that have these same tropes of characters dressing up as other genders, disguising themselves, falling in love, love at first sight, everyone gets married at the end, it's all the same stuff. So I would give this a 3 out of 5. It's fine. It's fine. Okay, book 3, this is world literature, and this is kind of cheating because this is Silence by Shusaku Endo. This is a work of Japanese literature from the 1960s, and it's historical fiction. It's set in the 1600s where a group of Portuguese Catholic missionaries go to Japan in the historical era where a lot of Japanese rulers were rebelling against the idea of Christianity as a foreign religion. So the missionaries that arrived in Japan were persecuted very extremely. They were tortured, they were subjected to really cruel treatment to try and get them to, I can't pronounce the word, but I think apostatize or something, to give up their faith, basically. And so the premise of this book is that a very well-regarded Catholic priest has previously gone to Japan, and the news has spread that that priest has given up his faith because of the conditions faced in Japan. And so the protagonist, Sebastian Rodriguez, and a friend or a colleague of his decides to brave this journey into Japan, a completely foreign country to them, to try and understand how could someone so faithful and so devout give up their religion? What kind of conditions could make an individual give up their faith? And to disclose, I do believe in Christianity, right? So reading this is particularly meaningful to me because it's quite rare to have literature that meaningfully explores themes of faith and doubt. I find that a lot of religious literature is unquestioningly faithful. This represents how faith is very powerful and can do amazing things. And a lot of secular, a lot of non-Christian literature just brushes it off or highly simplifies the nature of religion. And so it's very rare to find a book that sits in that middle ground where it does engage with ideas of religion, but not in a way that is just devoid of conflict. And I think this book is very painful to read for that reason. It has, if you're religious, the stakes that are explained in this book go beyond life and death, right? They are matters pertaining to the eternal soul, which is just huge, huge stakes. And you're looking at these characters go through incredible amounts of suffering and seeing them question, what is this all for? Is this worthwhile? Have we devoted all of our time and effort and worldly lives to nothing? And that's really the core motif and metaphor of this book. The title Silence refers to the silence of God in dark situations, right? If an individual is going through extremely testing times and they don't see a sign or they don't get instructions from the deity that they believe in, what is the purpose of their worship of that deity? What do they gain from that if in that period of crisis all they ask God for help and all they get is silence? It's an incredibly painful book to read. It's just, the depictions of suffering is just so extreme sometimes, and it's difficult in a way that not many other books that I've read are difficult. I also noticed that the structure is quite interesting because the first few chapters are framed as letters from Sebastian Rodriguez, and then it just goes to regular third-person prose for a few chapters, and then it goes to kind of found documents at the end. And I'm not entirely sure the benefits of doing that, because I kind of wonder, wouldn't it have been better to just use a consistent third-person voice throughout? But hey, I wasn't the one writing this book, so I can't criticize, right? I think thematically, it is really deep and rich. If you do subscribe to a faith. I feel like this will get you a lot harder than if you don't, of course. And if you don't subscribe to a faith, I don't know if this is particularly convincing. I wouldn't even say that the purpose of this book is to proselytize, right? It's not to represent religion as a be-all, end-all solution. Instead, it's trying to interrogate the struggles of believing in a faith, especially when just about all earthly logic would make it seem pointless and make it seem like folly. And I think it's also very interesting to read this in the lens of culture, because the ruling Japanese, I can't remember what title they have, but the person in this novel who strongly opposes Christian influence, they are very eloquent, and they give a meaningful defense for why a Western religion should not be introduced into Japan. I think about the time I read Things Fall Apart earlier this year, and it's a very similar theme, is that a Western religion, or I shouldn't even say Western religion, just Christianity, entering a country that is unfamiliar with it, fundamentally does change the kinds of values and beliefs that people there have, and it destabilizes the country in a way that a lot of missionaries just didn't understand at all. There was this really interesting comment about how various denominations of Christianity were entering Japan, and so there were the Dutch, who were the Protestants, and there were the Portuguese, who were the Catholics, and they went in conflict with each other, right? They brought their religious and political and economic tensions into Japan, and they made a big mess of it all. And it's very understandable why individuals would take extreme measures to force this religion out of your country when they can visibly see how much damage it's causing. And so, yeah, it forces so much introspection onto these characters. It's really, really worth reading if you have any interest in this. And all in all, I gave it 4 stars because I still, or at times, I had trouble connecting to the situation. It is a historical text, and at times it's difficult to understand all of the stakes and also the setting and the kind of circumstances, because it is just so far removed from what we understand. And maybe I wish it was longer, I'm not too sure just yet. I think that the characterization is fantastic, the writing itself, it uses some very overhanded metaphors, and it occurs quite a lot. Otherwise, it's quite interesting. The content is very extreme, very difficult to read, but yes, it's a very interesting book. A lot to say. Okay, next one I read is this Australian text, Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. This is a very classic Australian text, right? This is the one that has influenced a lot of writing going forward. It's from the 1960s, and it is Australian Gothic is how I would describe it. The premise is that there is this really stuffy Victorian boarding school, and it's student body, so it's an all-girls school, and the students go on this carriage ride to see the Hanging Rock, which is this real landmark around, I think, regional Victoria. And on that day, three girls just up and vanish and disappear, right? They go off wandering to the bush, and they just never found again. And this book functions as a kind of almost police procedural, because we see the investigation to where these girls went, what could have happened. We get the questioning of various people who are there. Oh, it's 3 girls and a teacher, yep. And all of them disappear. And then the mystery is really pervasive because we just don't know. We just don't know what happened. It is also a historical text. It is set in the early 1900s, but it is written in the 1960s. And so it really plays upon the facts that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the settlers in Australia were still trying to pretend that this country is just, England to Electric Boogaloo, right? And that is just an attitude which doesn't work in the often very, if not wild, then at least ecologically different landscape of Australia compared to England, right? There's this recurring theme that the Victorian school just doesn't belong in the Australian environment. It doesn't make sense to build this really big, old, historical building with a archaic and restrictive schooling system in this wild and natural country. And so there's a sense that the teachers are trying to enforce a sense of values and attitudes which might have been appropriate in England, but have no real place in Australia. And that's why these kinds of tragedies happen. is that no one fully understands this country on its own terms. Everyone's just trying to bring their own England into Australia. And so that's an interesting conflict that we have here. I think that the core mystery of this text was quite interesting because it's trying to mimic this Victorian style. The sentences can get very long and it's hard to pass. It gives me the same feeling that I got when I was reading The Turn of the Screw, where after reading a paragraph or two, I'd go back and think, actually, I don't really know what happened. I feel like I have to go back and read a few of these sentences to figure out what's happening. And so it did take more work to get through. And for a book written in the 1960s, I was very surprised at how true it was to a very archaic style. But for what it's worth, it is an enjoyable read. I gave it a 3 out of 5, just because I think personally I don't like this whole mystery angle as much. I do like the whimsy of it, but maybe there's clues that I'm missing. Maybe I need to read it more deeply. But ultimately I left thinking, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Okay, book 5, this is Modern Literary. This is a collection of short stories, Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Machado. Super, super famous. And I am surprised at the extent to which this collection blew up. Just looking at the cover and looking at all the things that I've read about it, I went into this assuming this was going to be just postmodern, wry, feminist short fiction, right? Just stories about assumptions of gender in modern society, and I was really, really wrong. This is a body horror text. Every single one of these stories has something to do with, like, a horrific representation of the human body. Various terrifying parts of the human body. Whether it is very graphic descriptions of illnesses, or just strange growths here and there, or turning into ghosts, or just lots of really weird bodily things, right? And the descriptions here are often quite gratuitous to make you just very uncomfortable and to think, ugh. And yeah, that was just pervasive in all these stories, is that there's this just sense of making the human body a really horrific thing, but linking that to, I guess, assumptions of gender and assumptions of identity in postmodern society. I thought that there was also just a really interesting desire to experiment with form in this collection. I thought that lots of stories just did really, really interesting things with short story structure or even text structure. One of the most famous examples is especially Heinous, and that story is literally just all of the titles, the episode titles of Law & Order SVU, and every single one is a little fictionalized blurb of what that episode could be about. But you sequence them all together and it becomes this crazy Twin Peaks style surreal story about detectives and doppelgangers and ghosts and hauntings and alien abductions, and it's just wild. It's just so much fun. And I think that probably that's why this is so successful, is that it successfully delivers these very novel, very interesting worlds with that little bit of edge of social commentary, but ultimately it's just a fascinating look at what the short story can do and how the horror genre specifically can be used for social commentary. I also thought that the depictions of characters were just really interesting. They were all very vivid, and for what it's worth, I feel like body horror as a genre usually can be quite gratuitous, because body horror is something that is carnally scary, right? It's something that gets to us on a very primal level. Like looking at bodies turned into horrors or turned into scary things. You don't really need to deal with plot or setting or character. You can just describe something horrific and that'll result in an emotional reaction. And this book really refutes that, because it does still go through the effort of making characters you care about, relationships that are interesting, plot developments that make sense. And the body horror is an addition to that. It's not really the draw of these stories, but it is still there and it's still present. So I really like this approach, and I gave it a 4 out of 5. Stories are very consistent. Nearly all of them were very enjoyable for me. And I can look at each of these titles and go, oh, that's the one with this, that's the one with that. They're all very different, and they're all very interesting. So highly recommended, Her Body and Other Parties. Okay, next one, going to my genre read. This is Everybody knows this one. This is The Hobbit. This is J.R.R. Tolkien's prequel to The Lord of the Rings, and I really like this edition. It's just such a visual edition, right? I love like the mountains and the night and the forest. It just captures the sense of adventure so much. And I will disclose that I have tried to read Lord of the Rings multiple times in my life, and I have failed horribly because I think what happens is, being someone who grew up in the noughties, you read Harry Potter, and then after Harry Potter you go, oh, I kind of like that, so what's similar to that? And someone will inevitably say, oh, hey, read Lord of the Rings. And Lord of the Rings is just completely different in its approach to Harry Potter, right? Harry Potter is about one character and one very normal human being character growing up and experiencing relatable teenage problems with magic as a kind of backdrop. Whereas Lord of the Rings is a dense world of fantasy that happens to have this quest through it. But why you read Lord of the Rings is for the richness of the world. Why you read Harry Potter is just for the individual hero's journey, right? And so The Hobbit is a great bridging between those two, because The Hobbit is much more of an individual hero's journey. The premise is so simple but so effective. We have Bilbo Baggins, who is a hobbit, and described by J.R.R. Tolkien, Hobbit is just a little dude, right? A little dude. And he lives in this hole, and it's a very hospitable hole, and one day, 12 dwarves and a wizard just barge into his front door and say, we're going on an adventure, we need you to be our burglar. And Bilbo Baggins goes, I have never burgled a thing in my life. Why are you bringing me? And so he has this very great reluctance to the quest, and he just gets pulled along anyway. I think what I like about this as an adult now is that I really sympathize with the character like Bilbo Baggins, where a call to adventure arrives on his front door, and I know in Joseph Campbell's A Hero's Journey is that the call needs to be refused in some way, right? But often in stories that use this, the call is refused because the character is afraid or inexperienced, or because they, I guess, don't see the importance of the quest, or because they're personally arrogant or some kind of flaw in their character. Bilbo Baggins just refuses the quest because he just doesn't feel like it, right? He's just like, oh, an adventure? That sounds tedious. I'm just going to stay home and drink my tea. And that's so relatable to me, and I just very much enjoyed that. And the premise is also just so simple. The dragon Smaug has taken over the home of the dwarves and is just hoarding a bunch of treasure in the mountain. And so these dwarves gather together and they go, we're going to go do some wealth redistribution, we're going to quest across the countryside, we're going to go through all these dangerous environments, we're going to eventually go to the dragon's lair, kill the dragon, get all our treasure back, and everything's going to be good. And that's exactly what happens, right? There's no gimmicks, there's no weird things, just a very simple fantasy story that's very enjoyable. It has a great sense of humor in addition to lots of moments of action and tension and just lots of things happen. So, did I enjoy it? Yeah, I did enjoy it. I was surprised because I was expecting to not enjoy myself very much. I mentioned before when I was reading Northern Lights that I just don't have a very strong relationship to fantasy. Beyond the kinds of things that I read in my teenage years, it just doesn't mean anything to me. I read a fantasy book and see them trying to world build, and I think I just don't really care. And I think maybe it took a protagonist like Bilbo Baggins, who also just doesn't really care, to get me into the mood. But I really enjoyed it. I gave this a 4 out of 5. I do not think I will then go to read Lord of the Rings. I think I will still dislike Lord of the Rings, because this is so simple, it's so casual, it's so easy to enjoy, and Lord of the Rings is more of a demanding investment, so we will see. Okay, last one for light reading. I did A Famished Heart by Nicola White. This is a Dublin-based crime story, and it's a very simple closed-room mystery. We have 2 older sisters who pass away in a house due to starvation, and this house is locked from the inside. There's a sense that these 2 women went on some kind of religious ritual of fasting, and they ended up passing away because of malnutrition. But it gets very weird, right? One character seems to have passed away a week or 2 earlier than the other, and the one who passed away later didn't seem to want to go through with this ritual quite as much. And so it's all about, how did this happen? Why did this happen? There's police sirens in the distance because this is a police procedural novel, and it's following the investigation into the deaths of these 2 characters. It's also about Francesca McNamara, I'm not really sure how to pronounce that surname, who has left her family situation to go be an actress in the United States. And she's the sister of the two who passed away, so she has to come back and, I guess, feel the consequences of the family dynamic that she initially left. As a crime story, I think it's quite conventional. It follows all those same steps, right? There's a mystery, someone's passed away, there's an investigation, there's clues, there's twists, there's red herrings, all of that is what you would come to expect. I think that this book, though, does skew a bit more on the literary side, and the reason why I say that is because it is interested in more than just the mystery itself. It also cares about its characters, and I don't know if that's what I wanted from this book, because there's lots of chapters exploring Francesca and what her life is like, and how she changes as a person, going from Dublin to America and back to Dublin. I didn't really see the point of that. I mean, I do see the point, right? The point is to make it more of a literary novel and to care about the characters and the setting and the themes and all that. But that wasn't really what I was interested in, because there were two characters who died of starvation, and I wanted to know about that. I want to know what the resolution is. I want to know how it happened. I want to know why this happened and who was responsible, and all of the other moments of characterization was just like distractions, right? And I just kept thinking, just get to the investigation. And once we do get to the investigation, it is an enjoyable read. I think the twists are very unexpected, and the character motivations do come true very cleanly, and yeah, I did enjoy it quite a bit. One thing I will mention is that it does rely on the reader kind of knowing how Dublin's geography and architecture work, because there's a specific description of how the house is set up, and actually the book's cover is a clue to it, right? And if you don't quite know how these houses are built and how they're structured and what kind of rooms they have and how they all connect together, it doesn't make quite as much sense as if... So as I was reading, I really needed to think about, well, actually spatially, how does all this work, right? How does the downstairs and the upstairs and the connections to the neighboring houses, like how does that all work? Because in Australia, we have this wide open splat where we don't have this kind of dense construction. And so I think at times I was distracted from the thriller because of just trying to figure out how the geography works. So if anything, this is a good argument for regional crime and reading crime fiction from your area or an area that you've been to or that you're interested in, because it does explore the idea of place so much better, because the kinds of situations that occur in this book can only really occur in this Irish context, right? And I think that makes it a bit more valuable than just any old generic crime story. So that was a 3 out of 5. That is my books of the month. Okay, and that's everything I got here. Everything was kind of vaguely crime themed, like I was saying. There's lots of different kinds of crime, mysteries, investigations, some fantasy crime. I would say that The Hobbit is a really great fantasy crime novel because it's really about a caper, right? It's really about collecting a team together to go and steal some stuff from a really powerful dude. And ultimately, it's taught me a lot about how this genre gets structured, and what makes it so interesting is that we are always interested in some semblance of truth. And a narrative structure that seeks to reveal a truth at the end is always going to be compelling in some sense. So that's my takeaway for this month. I will see you guys next month, and thank you for joining. Goodbye!